Hi, everyone. I'm Jess, and I'm the founder of Psych Crisis. It's a new organization aimed at reforming the way that we do psychiatric crisis care. And if you don't, if you haven't met me or you don't know the story, my brother had a series of mental health crises, which involved him staying in a psych ward for quite a while, and then he unfortunately escaped from the hospital and took his life. So the intention with Psych Crisis is to find a future where that sort of thing doesn't happen to people. And the Lived Expertise Project is sort of a first step in that direction. So what this event is going to involve is I'm going to tell you a bit about what the Lived Expertise Project is, what I did as a research project, what I learned and sort of how I've interpreted that and understood it, and then open it up for your questions, advice, disagreements, feedback, all that sort of thing. So we should be, it's 5 where I am, and we should be ending at 6:30. That's including Q&A and everything. So I really appreciate everybody being here. I'm very excited that everybody's here, and I this is the very first sort of event, public event that I'm doing. So you're all like early, you're in on the ground floor supporters, so I really appreciate that. So the Lived Expertise Project. This, for the last few months, has been a project with a question, and the question is, well, the first question is, how do we make psychiatric crisis care better? The second question is, what do we mean by better? What do we want it to look like? And the third question is, who's already doing it well? And so this project came out of an attempt to answer that question better. Or to answer that question at all, who's already doing it? So this was the fundamental question I started with, which is the people who have had a psychiatric crisis and they're now doing really well. What are they doing? What did they do differently? What are they doing differently? The implicit assumption is we can learn from these people to figure out what good crisis response might want to look like. So for people who aren't intimately familiar with the ins and outs of what happens when someone has a crisis, I'm talking in this instance about 3 different kinds of situation, and 2 of them are pretty related. And in this research project, I talked to people who'd had these 3 kinds of experiences. So the first one is that they were psychotic, so they were so disorganized in their thinking and their acting that they really weren't in a shared reality with everybody else. The second is that they might have had a manic episode, which is essentially really high energy, and it can also be psychotic. So someone who is manic may be so incredibly energetic that they then experience psychosis. And then the third is suicidality, which most people would at least know about, which is essentially like that they have an extreme urge to end their lives. So I'm going to explain a little bit about the structure of the research project and what tools I was using, and then get into like what I learned. So there are 3 core assumptions that this project started with. And the first assumption seems sort of straightforward, but mental health has a lot of taboos. So the first assumption was just like, if I asked people what they were doing, they would tell me. And they wouldn't sort of give me a different story or like avoid the question or something. The second is that someone who has a crisis like this develops some kind of trainable skill, or someone who has a crisis and succeeds at coping with it and flourishing afterwards has some sort of trainable skill. And the third is that this kind of trainable skill is like necessary and deeply involved with whatever good crisis response should look like. So keep those in mind. Those are like the 3 sort of like worldview assumptions that we're starting with. And then we get into what I used. So I've been conceptualizing this flourishing or this capability as expertise. And so I used these two different methods that are from an organization called the Cognitive Task Analysis Institute. And they normally research things like how do military commanders make decisions, how do firefighters make decisions. They're looking at understanding expertise that happens inside someone's head. And so because it was the right balance of like, you're rigorously understanding what someone's doing and you're not trying to hold it to a gold standard of a randomized controlled trial or something, it seemed like a pretty good tool to use, and it was pretty quick to learn. It took like 10 hours to learn how to do this interview process, and then to like start implementing it. So essentially, the one that I mostly use, which I'll talk about, is applied cognitive task analysis. And it's asking for an overview of the task that people are doing, and then essentially like asking a bunch of clarifying questions that are all specific and prescribed about like what the person is noticing, what the big picture is about it, how they deal with anomalies, things like that. And you're really trying to get at like, what is the difference between an expert and someone who is who would be a novice in this situation. So I'll tell you a little bit about who I ended up interviewing. There were 10 interviewees in total and 11 interviews. And there were like 66 men and 4 women, 9 cis people and 1 trans person. And then you can see the mix of ages. I've done them very roughly because I don't have exact ages for some people. And then we get into what were the kind of crises that they had dealt with. So so 5 of the people had manic episodes. 2 people had psychotic episodes that weren't manic. And 3 people had experienced suicidal episodes. And one of the things that becomes relevant later is that most people, or 50% of people, had only had 1 crisis, by their own definition, and may have had things that were sort of not quite as acute. But the one person had 6 episodes, and then there were a couple of 2 and 3. So yeah, this is sort of like split across the person who had 6, it was manic episodes. A lot of the people who'd had manic episodes had only had 1. Actually, I'll go back. Before I show you the overview of what people did, I want to just explain what I'm doing, which is with each person, I got them to walk me through their process for dealing with a potential manic episode or dealing with a potential suicidal spiral. Those are the terms I ended up using most often. And sometimes we focused more on something like preparing for or managing or preventing. And sometimes we focused on like coping with once it happened. And for all of the people involved, there was a bit of like negotiation to figure out like what are the boundaries of the task that we're talking about. But I was generally focused on some sort of like episodic format. So I'm not talking about like what were the things you used over the course of a year. It's more like what were the things you used over the course of like a few hours or a few days. So this next thing is a sort of amalgamation of the helpful strategies that people, or the helpful processes that we use by people who are dealing with a manic episode or potential manic episode. I've kind of unified them. A lot of them had some things in common. So they're essentially like these 3 steps. There's an observation step. There's a sort of like reducing commitments, reducing stresses. And then there's this 3rd section, which is sort of like 3 different things. It's like putting routine back in, doing things that are like dampening or dulling, and then like allowing the energy to express itself. Because normally with mania, you have a lot of energy. And just as a note on the writing or the hypomania, hypo means like slightly below the threshold. And generally when someone becomes manic, they go through a period of being like a bit more energetic, but not overwhelmingly energetic. And so often that's the thing that people notice to notice when something's off. So I've added here some of the noticing, so things people were noticing specifically. And for the mania section, I just want to say again and again that everybody mentioned sleep repeatedly and obsessively. I could, as far as I could tell, mania might be like a sleep disorder because it was mentioned so frequently. But essentially, people were able to notice when they were sleeping less, and then take steps to sleep more. So make sleep a priority is one of those sort of interventions people would do. Some of the other things that people were noticing that came up a lot, some of the things that are sort of externally measurable are talking faster, being more reckless, like reckless driving was mentioned a few times, lower pain sensitivity was mentioned, but the two that were more thought related were this sense that everything you see around you that's happening is happening for you or because of you, like you're somehow really significant. This is this everything's about me. And the other is thought divergence. So rather than having one train of thought, even if it's really fast, you sort of have like 5 different trains of thought that are all like taking off at, you know, one after the other. And then the things that people used as sort of responses, there's things that got people back into a routine, and that was most often sleep again. Also taking out things that were stimulating, and using, yeah, things that were dulling was also mentioned. So like something that makes you really tired or lethargic was mentioned as something that people used to when they were feeling too energetic. So with all of the interviews, I asked people like, what makes it difficult to implement this step, like this strategy? And the main thing, the main 2 things about mania is it feels good when it's happening, so people don't want to stop. Like it's like a bit of a high. And the second thing is when someone is in a manic state, they feel like they trust everything, or they trust themselves a lot. So it sort of like gives you a sense of self-trust that's much higher than you would otherwise have. So over a long period of time, it's difficult to figure out like, how much should I be trusting myself when I feel like in my body that it's good to trust myself? Like, is that untrustworthy in some way? So that's one of the things that was repeatedly found difficult. And 3 things that people mentioned about that were having multiple measures and observations. So things like wearables, things like journals, things like someone's like sleep metrics was again brought up again and again as something people would check. And having other people that they trust, which can be fraught because those people can sometimes get very anxious about like, oh, you're being a bit manic or something. And then the third was having things that people were committed to that gave them a reason to sort of like not let things get out of control. So in one case it was someone's child, some case it was like spiritual commitments, but yeah, so that's mania. And I will note that I had two people who I spoke to who had experiences of psychosis that wasn't manic, but I don't really have enough generalizations to tell you all this stuff about them. So I'm gonna go straight to suicidality, and then after that, implications. So this was the common pattern for someone responding to suicidality. And for someone who was experiencing a suicidal urge, it could sometimes be very short or quick or surprising, as opposed to someone who's feeling manic, which might happen over a lot longer time. So again, there's the noticing, and a bunch of strategies for responding, and then acting, which was brought up quite a few times, like taking action in response to whatever triggered the feeling of suicidality. So again, these are the things people were noticing. Some of them are internal, so they were noticing, like, what does it feel like in my body right now? Sometimes, and then sometimes it was like observing things. So like noticing, I haven't seen anybody in 10 days. I haven't wanted to like do anything, just like sort of as if you were watching from an outside perspective. And then most of the responses were, a lot of the time there was a balance of two kinds of responses. One was feeling what was going on, so like allowing whatever intense feelings to arise in their body and in their mind, and just like let them happen without needing to do anything. And the second was avoiding that. So like distracting yourself and doing something that would sort of make those feelings go away. And for the people I spoke to, they described a process of learning to use different strategies that were avoiding but maybe less harmful, like less self-destructive, and also sort of like going in and out and doing as much feeling as they were capable of in that moment, and knowing that they sometimes just couldn't completely feel everything, they had to use an avoiding strategy. And then doing things that, like, sort of noticing like what you really wanted to do and then doing that was also something that was mentioned a lot. So the things that were mentioned about dealing with a suicidal spiral that were difficult were sort of a couple of different categories. One was there are some moods that make it hard to notice that you're in that mood. So if you're overwhelmed, it's hard to notice you're overwhelmed. If you're dissociated, it's hard to notice you're dissociated. And this happens to everybody a lot of the time, but if someone's dissociated a lot, then their meta-awareness might be turned off a lot. And when I say meta-awareness, I mean the part of your mind that's noticing what's happening in your mind and can take steps to change it. So it can be like, wow, I'm really anxious. I'll go sit outside in the sun, or I'll call my friend or something. That's your meta-awareness, is noticing that. And then there were a couple of strategies and attitudes that people may have been unfamiliar with, or just hadn't had a lot of in their life, particularly like growing up. So like accepting a feeling, being with the feeling rather than like intellectualizing it. And the third thing that's difficult is that a lot of these behaviors spiral. So like once you haven't gotten out of bed, getting out of bed gets harder, or like once you've like failed at something, then you feel like a failure, which maybe makes you do things that make you feel more like a failure. And these things can be sort of contributing to the general mood that someone gets in when they might potentially feel suicidal. So the strategies that people mentioned for this were all things that you practice primarily when there wasn't a crisis. So everyone that I spoke to basically said, like, you can't do that much practicing if you're overwhelmed. Feeling suicidal is generally feeling overwhelmed, so you need to practice at a different time. So yeah, there was like these cultivating this like meta-awareness, knowing what's going on, feeling emotions, and then feeling some kind of like self-love or self-acceptance. So I'm going through all of that. These are the two kinds of crisis and the kinds of expertise that people had. Some of them I'm like, I don't think this is expertise, like for example, with sleeping, people just described like, they're like, I use sleeping pills, or I, like just really prioritize sleep or something like that. Like they're doing something, but it's unclear that they're doing something that's got a practice component to it. And then self-love is another one where people practice it. And people who are on this call, I know, practice it a bunch. But like whether you frame it as expertise is sort of like a bit of a weird question. Yeah. Cool. So I also wanted to talk about things that I discovered that weren't expertise that came up again and again. And I should also caveat that the people that I spoke to mostly were people who had like, you know, a family support of some kind. They had, you know, were in a fairly like some kind of privileged background, often very intelligent people. So they had a lot of resources that, you know, there are a lot of people who wouldn't have those already. But the things that were mentioned particularly, with mania, the thing that came up again and again was people going home to live with their parents for weeks or months after they had an episode. It was like, sometimes people mentioned like I had a housemaid who sort of looked after me, but like again and again, it was like I went home and I lived with my parents for like 3 months, and I don't know what I would have done after, you know, if not that. So that was really, I didn't expect that to come up at all. And the second two sort of resources were being in a good position with their employer so that if something came up, they were able to, basically they weren't going to get fired. They weren't going to get put in an even worse position once this like chaotic crisis thing happened. They were able to like take time off, or their employer would be like, you know, it's fine, like we still need you, come back when you're ready, that sort of thing. So people who were like, you know, like I have a job where I'm like, they really need me for whatever reason. That was surprisingly, or maybe unsurprisingly, but it turned out to be pretty relevant. It kept on coming up. And also that people had a psychiatrist that they could talk to quickly, like they didn't have like long lead times, who would sort of have a conversation with them and dialogue with them rather than just sort of like making a prescription and leaving. And that often there was someone that they could like know over time. There were different relationships to medication. Some people who had had a manic episode were on no medication. Some people were on some amount. And most people had used it through the actual process of, I think everyone had used it through the actual episode, at least while it was happening. And the last thing that was really helpful, that seemed really helpful for quite a few people, was something that gave them a sense that having had a manic episode had some some benefit or wasn't just damaging. Like the opposite would be someone who had a manic episode and then afterwards sort of lost all their self-trust and believed that they were like broken somehow. But for people, you know, who seemed to like be really flourishing, there was some sense of like something that they had learned out of it, or a way of being that they had had access to that they didn't have access to before, like a kind of perspective, something like that. And then things that were important for suicidality, social environment was seen as quite important, and people around having the capacity to be non-judgmental and allow emotions to happen. And then the last thing that was helpful was, it's sort of hard to lump all of this in one group, but like basically things you could do to make your situation better. So, you know, in one person's situation, they described one of the most dangerous times is when they had run out of treatments. Like they had done every treatment that they could do and there weren't any left. And yeah, it was described as like, if there's something you can do, something that's hopeful, then that's really important. All right, so let's go look at those assumptions. Basically, I think I got like 50% of this, well, 50% of it turned out to be like relevant or true. What came up again and again with the second assumption that people develop crisis expertise was that some people developed expertise either at a micro level, like day to day, like I'm going a little up and a little down, I can manage my mood like a plane, or you know, in one case it was after several episodes. It was like 6 episodes. Like there's a routine, there's a lot of learning, But that like the first or second episode are not, they're not developing some kind of expertise. And for the people who'd only had one episode, there was often a lot of like unknown of like, if something were to happen again, I don't know how my skills would hold up just because it hasn't been tested. And then with people who'd experienced suicidal spirals, suicidal crises, what came up was not that they got better at like dealing with a situation where they were at the brink of suicide, but that they got better at something that was every day and day to day. And maybe also that their beliefs changed, their like what they felt about themselves changed. And so their day to day sort of got better, and then the crisis stopped. It wasn't that they got better at dealing with the crisis. And then that brings me to the last assumption, which is that in order for us or anyone to improve crisis response, we need to improve how the people having the crisis like have expertise in that situation. The answer is sort of like, it doesn't work. It doesn't work that way. So I already mentioned that with someone who's suicidal, once they have the skills, the crises go away or become more minor. That happened with the people, I had 3 interviewees, and with them, it happened with every person. Often it was like, you know, in one case, it was like, oh, like this hasn't happened in several years. So I'm like that much better at dealing with whatever the situation is. Not that they don't feel intense, like, you know, like something that's very intense, but that like it doesn't rise to the level of crisis, or it rarely does. And then the problem, I don't know if it's a problem with mania, is that people don't get enough practice. You know, as I said, like 5 of the people that I interviewed had only had 1 episode, and they mentioned that they can't really practice something in a normal state that will then translate into feeling manic, because the internal experience is so different. And most people, a lot of people, the aim is that they only ever have 1, if they have 1. So that was sort of a bit tricky. It was like, well, if you want people to develop expertise, they have to have more episodes, which, you know, in and of itself is like, a lot of people don't want to do that, for many reasons. Cool. So there were these other things I ran into, which were like problems with the expertise framing. The thing I mentioned with mania is if we were to train people in the skills needed to handle their own crises, you would have to train everybody, because you don't know who's going to have a crisis. And also couldn't really, you know, with people using medication, it seemed like the skill involved with that was basically just the same meta-awareness that they'd had for a lot of other things. And then lastly, the thing where people have made meaning out of it was really important, but didn't quite seem like something to do with expertise. Like it, you know, it was almost like a worldview or a spiritual attitude or something. So yeah, and then with suicidality, I also already mentioned that the thing that seemed to help people the most was the expertise they developed when they weren't in a crisis. And yeah, also there's an issue with like someone who's not feeling very self-confident, maybe not even wanting to develop expertise in the first place. Like they don't have the, you know, the belief like I can get better at this. And there was also this question I had of like, how much of this improvement for people is from their skill, like something that they've improved, that, you know, the way that they're approaching the world, versus like they got into a situation where they felt more accepted by other people. They were able to accept themselves more because other people were, or some other thing. So more like social and developmental questions. They seem to come up as much as sort of expertise questions. So yeah, I sort of by the end came to this framing about expertise because we talked a lot about the tipping point, the point at which someone lost their ability to sort of notice and steer their internal experience. And for most people, that was the crisis, and that was when they were least able to do anything about it. So it actually seems that like developing expertise in that is like extremely rare and extremely like difficult by design almost. Like most people aren't in this state a lot of the time. Or if they are, then practicing might be really hard. Cool. So now we talk about some limitations. I already mentioned that some people don't have as many crises because they're not reaching these extreme overwhelm states. And also mentioned that people who'd had a manic episode didn't know, they're like, I don't know if it's going to happen again. They couldn't really tell, and they didn't know how they were going to respond. The third thing I ran into was that the expertise model I was using was for like people doing things in the world. And so a lot of the questions were geared towards things like situational awareness, which is a really hard thing to adapt to an internal, like, to an internal situation. Like, if you ask a question of like, you suddenly arrived on the scene, well, what does it mean to arrive on the scene? Like if you've been in the scene your entire life, because the scene is your body. So some of the questions were a little like funky. I had to adapt them and make them make a bit more sense because they didn't make sense in the context of like always being inside your mind. Some limitations. But I actually, let me get this. No. Okay. But yeah, so basically where this has led me is that in order to keep asking this question of like, who's doing it really well, I need to talk to people who have essentially more reps. So the most reps I had of an extreme crisis situation in this group of people was 6 crises. And that was like quite a lot, So the aim is to talk to clinicians. I've already talked to one clinician who's seen many more of these sorts of situations. But then separately from that, I have been, as a result of these interviews, focusing on how can we give people situational awareness as quickly as possible when something is happening that they're not prepared for. So sort of like just-in-time crisis response or crisis management. And I've already started that with this guide that's like a support guide for someone whose loved one is going through a manic episode. But that's sort of like a crap, something's going on, I need to know what to do now. But I didn't know that I needed to know what to do like 2 months ago. So that's sort of like recognizing that people just don't have that, that they can't predict the future. And then the third is that like, it became really clear that these 3 major kinds of crises, particularly mania, psychosis, and suicidality, are just very different. And that they sort of even like are crises in different ways. Like they have different lengths of time. There's different things controlling like when they come back and stuff. So essentially the thing that I learned from that is to focus on them separately. All right, cool. So that is what I've got about what I've done in the last few months. The next section, we're sort of just going to open up for questions, comments. I would start with clarifying questions, but any questions and comments are fair game after that. Lovely friend Tasha is going to help just like moderate that a bit. And if you're interested in following this madcap project, then yeah, the Substack is just there. So, all right.
And if you have questions, feel free to either raise your hand or drop them in the chat.
Yeah.
Maybe just to start, you've talked a lot about suicidality and mania, and I wonder, could you give a brief description of what psychosis might look like in practice if someone was having a more of the psychotic episode type situation?
Yeah. So the reason that it isn't, I didn't focus on it so much is because it's probably of the three, the one that I understand the least. But my understanding is it's very similar to mania, except it's not high energy. So someone who is experiencing psychosis might also not be sleeping very well. They might also like have extremely like new, unusual thoughts. So like their beliefs might change pretty rapidly. And they do also have the thing that I mentioned in mania, which I forget the name of it. It's not subjective referentiality, but the experience where everything is about you. So that in people who are experiencing psychosis can be more like paranoia. People who are manic can also experience paranoia, but the sense of like there are eyes watching you or something. Yeah, that is this sort of like the everything's about me thing. So yeah, there's also often a sense of like obsessiveness, but I would say that the thing I've noticed from the people that I talked to, at least, was the sense that like things are about you, or that things are connected in a way that they wouldn't otherwise be connected, is the main thing. But my understanding, this is why I don't really get it as much, is that it can often last be a lot longer. Like someone who is acutely manic, like they're expending so much energy and like they often end up being taken to hospital pretty soon, you know. Not always, but like there's sort of this acute thing happening, whereas my understanding is that sometimes people who can be psychotic for a while and it sort of happens over a longer period of time. Yeah, so that's a brief idea.
That's helpful, thank you. We've got a couple of questions in the chat. Luke was asking, was there an age range that you looked at with this work, or differences among the ages in any of these domains?
Yeah, so the oldest person, I actually don't know who was the oldest person because I didn't take exact ages, so I'm going on very rough ages here. Oldest person would have been like 40s, late 40s. So it's common that, well, so people who might feel suicidal, sometimes there's an intensity of that when someone's like a teenager, and that they can feel less suicidal as they get older. That's not in every case. There's also a lot of suicides that happen in like men over 50, but I didn't have any people in my sample that were that age. So yeah, the thing about people that were, there is sometimes something that happens over time, particularly when people go through their 20s, where they something like get better at emotional regulation as a normal developmental process. So sometimes that was like part of the story people were telling me about like what had happened over time. And then with manic episodes, it's more common that they happen somewhere between someone's like mid 20s and early 30s. I think it's often like men, it happens slightly earlier than women. So I was often talking to people who were like late 20s, early 30s who'd had one manic episode. This is more speculative because I didn't talk to a lot of people who are a lot older, but my sense is that if someone has like this one episode and it somehow gets like, you know, they have enough rest and enough integration and enough social support, and like they're able to do a bunch of like therapeutic practice stuff, then that may never happen again in their life, or they may have like one minor thing that happens like many years down the track. But that for some people, the first episode sort of starts a spiral because it makes their life harder to deal with, which then makes everything harder to deal with. No one I talked to in this sample was really like that, because most people were like, by their own definition, flourishing. So yeah, those are some age differences. Yeah.
Great. And Elliot would like to know, I'm just going to read Elliot's question verbatim. If the incident itself is past the tipping point of self-awareness and self-regulation, I'm curious if there are any preconditions that didn't code as an incident but were identifiable or downregulable, for example, sleep state prior to the incident or anxiety feedback loop thoughts.
Yeah, so basically everybody told me that what they currently do now is they respond to those like preconditions. Like that was one of the reasons it was difficult to like to identify how they respond to an episode, because they were essentially like, I'm responding to the preconditions before the situation arises. Yeah, that was pretty much everybody had. They could tell me, you know, if a crisis was like 10, they could tell me what it was like at a 3 and be like, yeah, at 3 I'm already adjusting, you know.
Great. And another question from Luke is, did you take family histories at all, and how people potentially related to family trends in any of these domains?
I didn't take any family histories, no. So I don't have any information on, like, I sometimes I learned some facts, but I didn't take any anything systematic.
That makes me want to ask personally, is there any questions, like any piece of information that you didn't capture that you'd want to do in future research?
Yeah, so for a lot of people, I didn't have a lot of specific information on medication. And, you know, I personally have like my working hypothesis is, for example, for people with experiencing a manic episode, that having like a minimal amount of medication rather than like a hammer, like a huge amount, is like better long term. So yeah, what else would I have wanted to know? I mean, if I had my ideal world, I would have like interviewed their clinicians or something. Like I would have talked to the people who treated them. That would have been a really, and also like family members or something, like just like more people dealing with the same incident. Yeah.
Great. And another question, this may be a bit far off, but could it make sense to frame manic episodes as almost more extreme ends of quarter or midlife crisis, given the age range you saw it most common in 25 to 35?
Yeah, I don't know. I think that there is, so mania seems to have something to do with like, well, it has something to do with like stresses, and it you know, it does seem like there's something developmental in some of the situations, like people have some sort of new thing that they're dealing with. But also like, I don't know if this is really true for mania, but in the case of psychosis, like for example, like women who've had children are also at risk of it. So like in my mind, there is probably something that's happening at a like the way that your body develops level, that means that it happens at that time, but then also that there are different pressures that we like systematically get subject to at different times. And that would be like, but yeah, like I'm sort of like grasping at straws here. Like I'm, you know, the general like pressure times susceptibility times like things that exacerbate it, like falling in love and weed and stuff like that, is like, feels like pretty straightforward.
Question from Michael. I'm curious, what is your background and professional expertise that brought you to these projects and this work? Had you been working in social work, psychology, mental health research, clinical work, etc.? What model or framework did you use to design the research?
Yeah, so I'm totally not a clinician in the slightest. The model that I'm using is much more of like a product discovery model. So like this sounds sort of like, you know, I had a clinical plan, like a clinical research plan, and then I executed the plan. But the reason that I chose this particular framework, the ACTA stuff, cognitive task analysis stuff, was that it's meant to be like practical for designing stuff, designing a training program or something like that. Yeah, like I've been more thinking about this from the perspective of like a designer, a product designer or something like that. I mean, I have like, you know, like graduate level statistics, and like I've done some experimental stuff, but that's in economics. It's not in medicine or anything like that. I'm trying not to like make, like I'm trying not to like replicate the wide, you know, collection of like strictly sort of like clinical research that's out there. I'm much more interested in like the service design questions and the like social design questions. So yeah.
Following on that, do you have any reflections on what it was like to use this framework in a context that it's not usually used in, and what that was like for you?
Yeah, so I really appreciate how like one of the things that is good is that this framework has been designed by people whose job it is to design like training stuff, which means that it's not trying to be fancy, which I think a lot of like sometimes things that are made for clinicians are trying to be fancy in some ways. It's very straightforward. Like the questions are very everyday questions. They're very straightforward questions. So it's like very much designed to help me as an individual doing the research, like manage my own cognitive load as well. Like it's not very overwhelming. Like I'm not having to think of 5 different things at once. It's like very systematic. I think that so what are a couple of the limitations? So definitely this tension between managing an episode as a task and more like the monitoring maintenance process that a lot of people describe was tricky to reconcile that with the fact that this process involves like find the steps, you know, like that's like the first part is like you find the steps in the task, and trying to carve out the steps in the task is like kind of tricky, although the CTA people acknowledge that that's hard. I already mentioned the stuff about this measuring subjective things, like the questions are just designed for people who are dealing with like objective reality, like they're dealing with like rocks and fires and stuff. So that was a little harder. Yeah. Maybe I think that might be like the main things about it. I would probably, if I was specifically focusing on technique and expertise, I would use it again, like for clinicians and stuff. But it's sort of not quite what's necessary for like looking at like systems that work. I think it wouldn't be sufficient for like, you know, understanding a system that's working really well. I think it's much more about an individual.
What are you planning to do with this research going forward?
So the interviews that were to do with mania specifically are currently what's informing this first version of the mania guide that I'm working on. So that's concretely what they're doing, like the strategies that people talked about. I'm hoping that if I do more research with clinicians, that that will give a better, like I would like there to be like, you know, publicly identifiable collections of this is the best we know how to do and this is what it looks like. So I imagine that the clinician interviews are sort of like a next step in the process of like building that. But probably not like, you know, I don't think the very next interviews I do with clinicians will be like, hi, NIMH, like, here's your gold standard, like, could you use this from now on? So it's sort of like a next step in, like, really just the approach is just, rather than we have a treatment, can we check if it works? It's just like, who works the best? What are they currently doing? Like that's the entire plan. Yeah.
And what has you wanting to focus on mania moving forward?
Well, so partially the reason is that's just what I'm more knowledgeable about, like like in terms of like family history and stuff. That's the thing I've had more experience with. It's also comparatively under, like there's a lot of attempts to improve how like suicide, like there's a lot of work on suicide and comparatively less on mania. Now there are fewer people who experience mania, but it can be disproportionately like disruptive, you know, like it's a very high intensity thing that happens to people. Yeah. I'm curious, any of the people who are currently online? Corey. Hi, Corey. What's your question?
Hi.
Hello.
Enjoy the talk. I had a question, and mostly clarifying questions. So you said that the people who built skills, that the skill was mainly noticing like precursor or trigger events or something, right? Were there any episodes in which people had built that skill, so they noticed, I'm losing sleep, I'm probably at higher risk of an episode, and then they went on to have an episode, but it was like qualitatively different? Or it seemed like it might have just been the case that as soon as they developed that kind of meta awareness, they just, that kind of like solved the episode.
I have one outlier who I'll abstract, but I think that they'd be happy with me talking about them in the abstract, which is someone who doesn't attempt to stop or like not have manic episodes. They actually want to have some manic episodes because in some way, to some level, while staying safe, because they value the thing that mania brings to their life. And so this person does have like you know, this like early warning signals thing, but then they are more like buckling in for the ride or something, and then they're like assembling their you know, their tools. Like this person actually I went back and did a second interview with, and they had an episode that got to psychotic mania and then stopped it. Like it actually like if you think of it, like they took the plane, that they had the plane take off and then the plane landed, you know, which is certainly the first time that and they did it without antipsychotics. So without the main medication that's used to treat mania. So yeah, I would say that was like qualitatively different from like their earlier episodes. But like whether or not the noticing versus not noticing made the difference, like it was often just like the question, like when they notice, like at what point did they notice? They you know, this particular person they would notice at some point. So
yeah, I was wondering if there was like some kind of catch-22 to where if the like main characterization of the episodes is inhibition in your meta awareness, if you develop the skill to like have meta awareness in the episode, then like the episodes just stop happening.
yes,
I don't know if that's true or not.
Yeah, so there is sort of something that seems to happen where someone, this is specifically talking about mania, someone who is like unconsciously riding a wave, you know, there's like energy that is building in them, like they're sleeping less, they're talking more, they're having all these great ideas. That person with more meta awareness can still experience extreme energy, but it is extremely different because they're not like out of control in some important way. And the one person, a different person who mentioned this, described it as through like a spiritual lens as like various kinds of like purifications. And so for them, it was like something that had some kind of spiritual meaning that this was happening. So yeah.
Cool, thanks.
Elliot's question. Would it be viable to train other first responders who are not the same person having an incident? Well, that's currently what we do. So the way we get CPR awareness training, not for ourselves, but in case somebody gets affected. Yeah, so that is, that's the default, which currently already happens in society. And so one group of people that doesn't get trained currently that could is people who are very close to someone who might have some kind of situation. And then obviously there's like better training, like for the people who currently are doing first responder work, we could train them better. There are many other things we could do, like that aren't just training, but that is one thing that could be improved. Well, I'm thinking we might actually wrap up earlier than I intended, because I think our question momentum is going to be more, is not going to extend for another half an hour. So maybe if there are like 1 or 2 more questions anyone has, then we can go with those. Otherwise we'll wrap. Yeah. I definitely appreciate everybody who's arrived and everybody who's stayed to hear how it works. Maybe I'll ask a question of everyone, which is like, what do you think is the most interesting question to ask next? Or like, where do you think this could go next? If it's trying to answer the question of like, what is the best possible crisis response? And you can type in chat or answer. Yeah, Luke.
Yeah. First off, thanks for sharing on all of this and doing all the work. It's really incredible. And like, I appreciate the perspective of coming outside of a clinical sphere for all the reasons you shared. The thing I think would be interesting and like what you were talking about like product design and this guide is like almost some form of journey map of like I have a vision in my head of like, you know, if you are X, then here's what has worked for others, YZ.
Yeah.
You know, because I think that there is definitely a distinction, which you brought up, between like people who have had an episode or experience and then self-identify as flourishing or beyond it, versus those who have multiple experiences, you know, or like have one and then they go away for a while, but then come back. And just like, I think that breaking down along those lines from like a design perspective would be really powerful. Like for allowing people who go through such experiences to like, one, feel like they're not alone, and then also like have, or, you know, loved ones, close ones, you know, kind of be able to say, oh, and, you know, while everybody is an individual, other people in similar situations, this is what has helped.
So like kind of at each step being like, you're at point B. At point B, other people found this thing helpful. Is that sort of?
Yeah, it's like that. Something a little more modular. Like I know as I was saying that, I was like, this feels rigid, but like if there's a way.
Yeah. So I mean, that is like at a very high level the thing that I'm working on with the Mania Guide, and the current audience for the Mania Guide is people who are like the loved one of someone going through an experience, not the person themselves, although ideally they'll sort of combine. But yeah, the like this thing is something that other people have found helpful is what I'm aiming for. The tricky thing is a very, very politically polarized question, not like big politics, but like some people are fiercely pro medication. Some people are fiercely anti-medication. Some people are like fiercely pro hospital. Some people are fiercely anti-hospital. And if you give someone advice from the other team, then they like won't trust you. So yeah, that's sort of like a meta consideration. I just want to answer Patrick's question briefly. How many subjects were involuntarily detained in mental health facilities? What were your findings on residential treatment? So I'm trying to think off the top of my head. I'm pretty sure that every person who'd experienced mania had been detained involuntarily, so that's 5. And of the people who experienced psychosis, 2 were detained. Actually, I think maybe all but 1 person had been detained involuntarily. And some people had spent some time in like longer term residential things. Most people were extremely motivated by not having to go back to a hospital. Like most people did not like hospital, found it very like unhelpful or scary or terrifying or something. The one thing that I would say, the two things that were an exception were, one, I've had Stanford repeated multiple times as a place that people went and it didn't suck. So a place that's at like one of the best research hospitals in the world or something, potentially that one I've had good feedback about. And the second was a few people had mentioned like longer term, like eating disorder rehab, unrelated, like not for suicidality, but because it came in connection, and that had sometimes been like somewhat helpful. So yeah, those are some of the things from the people that I talked to.
There's also another question from Michael.
Oh yeah.
How do you anticipate to go about identifying clinicians who have had encounters and support people in crisis?
How many do you intend to talk to is the answer is as many as possible. Like the limiting factor in this research project will be access to clinicians. It's easy to identify clinicians who've had and who support people in crisis. Like you can look at who works at a psych hospital. You can look at like all sorts of just like what's their job. The difficult thing is finding people who have a great track record. I don't currently have a plan for that, except for looking at their track record if it exists. You know, I've spoken to one person who's like a counselor, so that's their qualification, who runs an organization that hasn't lost a client to suicide. They're a suicide prevention like support organization. I have another person who's claimed that they had multiple years working as a psychiatrist and didn't lose a client to suicide. I'm not suggesting that be the metric, but like I would be looking at a couple of like success criteria. But yeah, the limiting factor is like how to find them. And that's just like a big search process, like looking through the professional organizations, getting referrals, getting recommendations. I think it'll be a lot harder than finding people from like the people that I had to interview who had mental health crises. So yeah, that's definitely the hardest part of that. So, Corey has a question or a reflection or something.
I have lots of questions all the time, but yeah. So one, it sounds like I've heard you mention some bits about trying to work within the system, potentially like I don't know, trying to maybe do something that looks like reforming hospital stuff or inpatient stuff or adding training or something. But also it sounds like you maybe are trying to approach it from outside the system, trying to create some kind of like independent resource that's accessible for people. And I just was curious if you had any thoughts about like where you leaned, or whether you're just trying to like throw stuff out and see what sticks, and whether you're trying to be a renegade or just like play nice with everybody.
Like a lot of, so my strategy is pragmatic, which is at the moment I'm a tiny one-person organization that has no credibility with anyone in the clinical world. So I'm trying to do something that I think will have a good chance of being able to improve based on feedback, which is the sort of like support guide thing. I do think that the process of change needs to involve or replace the systems that currently exist. But the issue with replacing is that like, even in a magical world where I could just copy paste and there's a brand new system there, the pool of people who would work in it is not large enough to have an entirely different system. Like there is such a shortage of people willing to work in acute crisis, like mental health crisis care, that, you know, if you're going to build a new system, you need to build it with the people who are working in the old one, because they're the ones who are willing to do it. Or you need to like change it so much that it's like available to different people. But that's sort of an economic question. So yeah, it's basically like be outside, build some credibility, build some like connections, see what is possible to change. Like, you know, the thing that's become clear to me for like state behavioral health departments, for example, is that they have they are running blind when it comes to funding. They have no idea what works, even by their extremely lax definition of work. And it's also incredibly expensive. So, you know, if I have something that says, hey, like everyone who's trying to get help for mania wants this kind of treatment and it's not available, like I'm hoping that that's at least something worth like connecting with like state officials or people like that about. Yeah, that's sort of where I'm at. I also think that there's like something, I'm optimistic about the strategy of like merely being the conduit to people, merely being the conduit and then also giving, like letting people give feedback. So like if it was easier to connect with a provider and also easier to loudly say that they're terrible, then like that's a very difficult problem, but it is a lot easier than improving every provider like by yourself. So that's sort of like seeming to me as like a high-ish leverage strategy, which is like being the making the information routing mechanism, which is something that's possible to do with like, you know, me and some small like a small group of people, as opposed to like, you know, it's just like the workforce of people, like the whole system is like so huge. I don't have other easy ins.
The other question I wanted to ask, if it's okay, is if I were like someone who just experienced my first episode of psychosis and I came out of it and was like, the hell's going on? I need to do something about this. What kind of like, and I was a super savvy person who figured out how to find stuff, what would I find on the internet right now? Are there like support groups or forums or something that are reasonable?
So
and not
there's
just...
like, there's the recovery community, which I think gives people a lot of social support, but it's not particularly rigorous. Like it sort of allows a lot of possibilities for like how you might manage things, sort of just like to keep the peace, but it's really good for like help people meeting someone else who's going through it. There are, I mean, if you're in a particularly privileged situation, you might end up with like some very like world-class hospital having some sort of like outpatient process that you can then like learn. You know, there are some like 2-year programs that do a bunch of like teaching you about how things work, doing a bunch of like sort of cognitive behavioral therapy for psychosis stuff. Like you could end up in one of those and like meeting clinicians, things that are online. There's a lot of like really like basic, like this is what bipolar, the other thing is it talks a lot about bipolar, and people don't often get into the nitty-gritty of like the difference between handling depression versus handling mania. And often like bipolar also means bipolar 2, which doesn't involve manic episodes. So there's a lot of static information, like WebMD sort of information, like drink water or whatever. There's, yeah. And there are some like management tools that are actually pretty good that are like often developed like universities and stuff, but they're not very well marketed, so it's hard to find them. Yeah. That's pretty much it. Michael.
Michael has his hand raised.
Oh yeah.
Hey, I just want to say wonderful presentation. I'm really enjoying all the content and the scope of the vision or the work, everything that you're trying to pull together here or have been pulling together. I think it's really beautiful. And I would whatever kind of like the next steps or ways to contribute, I think would be very exciting to see where it goes. So I'm going to go back and check out the blog. And maybe share other resources and things. So it's I guess I would say admirable what you've been able to pull together being outside of the mental health system or such. I've been working in the mental health system in New York City for about 8 years. And so I think what you're saying about the recovery community or in the field I work in is just what they call peer mental health or peer specialist mental health. So there are whole movements of people that I guess in the sense, in my capacity, you know, we neither like favor the system or disfavor, because if it fell apart tomorrow, we would be in, you know, probably a world of trouble. And also, if it existed on forever the way it is currently, also we would never see any change. So it's kind of like that blended model. But the thing that I found, and maybe what you're hinting at, is people changing the system from within inside, those who feel they have the capacity to work in it, and then those who don't, kind of like you're doing, working from the outside. And I think there, in my experience, there's a place for everybody. The community is like very wide and diverse and broad. And also I would say probably, I don't know what in the rest of the country, in the US, but within New York City, like one example of a program is called On Track, and they have like first episode psychosis.
This is one of the 2-year early psychosis programs, right?
Right. So so it doesn't track across maybe all of the US, but in some ways it's, you know, like the subtlety is like yes, the system is
there is still variation,
trained, and on the other hand, there's like some really groundbreaking, innovative work happening. You know, so the narrative's like both like flattening and very rich and diverse. So so like kudos to everything you're doing. And I'm
cool. I would love, I let's connect offline, because I would also just love to talk to you about New York specifically. I've done a bit of like investigation into New York and into Parachute specifically. I don't know. Parachute, and so I would just like love to learn more about it, about the New York situation.
Happy to connect.
My email, Tashan just put my email in there, so you can email me and can connect. Cool. All right. Do we have any final questions, or are we gonna wrap up? I think we're maybe good. Okay. Wonderful. Well, I appreciate you all for coming and for like listening and questioning and everything. And yeah, if you haven't followed, there's a Substack. You can know about other events and things like that. And just like see progress, like offer support, offer suggestions, all that sort of thing. So yeah, cool. All right. Well, goodbye, everybody, and I will see you around.